Good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to wait just a couple of seconds just to let a few more of us join, and then we'll get going with this webinar. Thank you for joining us all this afternoon. Okay, got quite a chunk of you here now. So I'm Amanda Saunders. I'm Senior Standards Manager for the ESG area at BSI. We've got a really packed webinar for you this afternoon on energy management guidelines for a phased implementation. And we hope that this will help you all get to grips with the standard. And if you haven't downloaded it, you'll go off and do so because it's free. Yeah, I think we're ready to go. So next slide, please. Okay, so a bit of housekeeping. This is a listen-only webinar, but it is being recorded, but nothing of you will be recorded. We welcome your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom, so you can put them in along the way. We've got a great panel of experts and practitioners and consultants and a member of BEIS, so there'll be lots of people to answer your questions. So we really welcome questions throughout, but particularly at the Q&A at the end. Yeah, simply click on the Q&A button in the side panel, post your question. If you've got any technical difficulties, also submit your issue there via the Q&A function. And then at the end of the webinar, there will be a feedback survey, as most webinars have, and it would be really useful if you would complete the survey because it's very helpful to us to try and improve our webinars. But also upon completion of the survey, you'll get the presentations and the recording. It's a CPD recognized webinar, so you can also request a certificate via the feedback survey as well. So just to introduce you to our panel today, we have one cancellation, I'm afraid. So Julia Shajicha is unable to join us as she's poorly, as one of those inevitable things at this moment. There's always somebody who's going to be a bit sick, but we're hoping to cover her area anyway. So we've got Ian Byrne and Kit Ung, and they work very closely with BSI. They're experts and practitioners in their fields, environmental management, energy management. So please do get your questions into them. And we're very happy and lucky to have Nazreen Fielding, who's Head of Policy for Resource and Energy Efficiency at BEIS. So please get some questions in for her. So I'm going to hand over to Ian Byrne, who will be your host today, and then he'll get us going. So thanks very much for joining.
Thanks, Amanda. I'd like to repeat the welcome and say hello to everyone who's attending the webinar today on the phased implementation of energy management systems. That's something of a mouthful, but put simply, it's intended to explain how the ISO 50005 standard, which is being made available to small businesses free by BEIS, can actually help you manage your energy better and help control your costs. And it's done through easy stages rather than necessarily taking a running jump and attempting to do it all at once. As Amanda said, my name's Ian Byrne, and I've been working with BSI, the British Standards Institution, and ISO, the International Organization for Standardization, for around 15 years now. Over that time, I've been helping them create hopefully useful and usable standards to help companies and other bodies improve their management of energy, improve their energy efficiency, and to provide a common basis for measurement of both energy savings and carbon savings. And obviously over the last few years, that's become much more of interest to some organizations, to some companies. But cutting back on energy use is usually the quickest and very often the cheapest way of reducing carbon emissions and starting out on the pathway to net zero, as well as making good, sound business sense. So I think it's a great place to start. But also we discovered a few years ago that although the standards were being well received by larger companies, perhaps those who'd already got a quality management system accredited to ISO 9001, it wasn't always all that easy for smaller firms to learn how to use them. There was a lot of jargon. There were a lot of things that perhaps made assumptions about the organization that small firms just didn't have. And it was especially true where they hadn't had any sort of formal energy management system beforehand. So it was clearly there was a gap there that needed filling. So we were pleased to support ISO in the development of a new standard, which has the snappy number of ISO 50005 to address this, even though it does have a rather unwieldy title of Energy Management Systems Guideline for a Phased Implementation. So to guide us through the guidelines and explain how it fits into the UK's wider decarbonisation, I'm pleased that we have a couple of experts with us here today. Firstly, we'll be hearing from Nazreen. Nazreen's just been introduced. and she's been working, I think, for over 15 years on energy and climate policy. And then we'll hear from Kit. And then finally, I will come back to give a little bit of to give a few examples of how companies that I've been working with have actually been implementing this, starting from square one, effectively from the very beginning. But let's first hear from Nazreen.
Thank you, Ian. Hi, everybody. Can we move on to the next slide?
Could you put your camera on, Nazreen?
Sure. Okay. Right. You might have seen this slide before. Essentially, the UK industrial sector plays an essential role in society, worth 180 billion economic value, contributes significantly to GDP, and is a major employer in the UK of 2.5 million people, direct jobs, which is pretty significant. Industry, as you know, is also a major source of CO2 emissions. Currently, industrial sectors produce about 15% of UK emissions, with just half of these concentrated in specific clusters, as demonstrated on the map on the right. And these are geographical areas with large concentrations of industry. The rest of the remaining emissions can be found in dispersed sites, which are industrial regions scattered around the UK. Next slide, please. The good news is that industrial emissions have more than halved since 1990. This can be attributed to several things, including the changing structure of the UK's manufacturing sector, improved energy efficiency, and a shift to low carbon fuels. However, despite this, more action is needed if we want to meet our net zero commitments. And we have set out our proposed plan to deliver net zero in industry through the Industrial Decarbonisation Strategy and the Net Zero Strategy, which was published last October. As these strategies set out, we aim to achieve this pathway by having a net zero aligned emissions trading scheme cap in place by January 2024, the latest. There's a consultation out on that now, and to send a strong market sign to the private sector to incentivise industry to take action on to decarbonise. We want to create a market for low carbon products through demand side measures, and we want to leverage resource and energy efficiency measures to achieve roughly 11 megatons of carbon per year of emission savings by 2035. We also have grand plans to have at least 2 CCUS clusters in place by the mid-2020s, which will increase to 4 by 2030, with the world's first net zero cluster in place by 2040. Next slide, please. Resource and energy efficiency measures are expected to help reduce industrial emissions to a new baseline through the 2020s. But while the required infrastructure for deep decarbonisation, such as CCUS, is being built up. Our industrial decarbonisation strategy estimates that as I mentioned, could deliver up to 11 megatons per year by 2035, and that could increase to 13 megatons by 2050. Industrial energy efficiency, as you know, is maintaining at least the same quality and level of output while using less energy in the process. And our long-term energy efficiency objective is to achieve around 4 megatons of annual emission savings by 2050. And there are important methods to help us do this, such as energy management systems, which we're talking about today, heat recovery and repurpose technologies, and other circular economy measures that can reduce the overall amount of emissions produced in manufacturing to reduce the level of energy and materials and keep industrial products in circulation for longer. We're really delighted to help sponsor the ISO standard we're here to talk about today. We think energy management systems are important to support businesses with managing their energy usage and in turn boosting productivity through outlining practical ways to improve energy usage, such as developing and implementing an energy policy or using energy efficient technologies. An energy management system ensures you understand how your organisation uses energy for manufacturing, heating, cooling, lighting, etc., and the various opportunities to reduce your energy usage. So we're really pleased to be supporting this. We hope that it will overcome information and knowledge barriers to energy efficiency interventions. And we're really pleased that it's been specifically created for SMEs to develop at their own pace. The ISO 50001 standard has a wider scope, and it's a route to compliance in the UK's Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme, ESOS, which some of you may be familiar with. But the ISO 50005 is ideal for SMEs that may not have the resources to implement ISO 50001. We believe that the energy management systems provide some benefits, such as cost advantage. They'll help you keep your energy bills under control at this really important critical time when bills are really high. And that could support further investment in energy or your wider business. It's really important for climate change mitigation. We've got our net zero target. It also may help give you a competitive advantage. Increasingly, potential suppliers are being judged on environmental, social and governance criteria and need to demonstrate that sustainability is at the heart of your organisation's activities. And energy management is part of that environmental strategy. Our sponsorship of the ISO 50005 standard expires in December 2022, so please download it soon. As a department, we are also looking at additional barriers to overcome and improve energy efficiency. These include access to finance, and one of the things that my team is also responsible for is the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which is a fund worth about 300 million that exists to help businesses cut their energy bills as well as carbon emissions through offering grant support in energy efficient or decarbonisation technologies, or with the cost of investigating the suitability of these technologies through feasibility or engineering studies. Since summer 2020, we've allocated about 160 million in support to industry, and our latest application round is open right now and is worth about 70 million to eligible industrial sectors, which include manufacturing, mining, quarrying, processing, recovered and recycled materials and data centres, and it closes on the 9th of September. Other financial incentives include the climate change agreements, where you can sign up as part of your sector through a trade association and you can get a discount on the climate change levy. There is also Her Majesty's Treasury super deduction scheme, incentivises companies to invest in productivity enhancing plants and machinery through providing capital allowances on these assets. And that scheme runs until March next year and allows companies to claim 130% of capital allowances on qualifying plant and machinery investments, with a tax cut up to 25 pence per pound invested. Yes, and that's essentially my brief summary of what I wanted to say today. I'm happy to take any questions later on. I should also flag that our energy advice offering is something we flagged in the recent British Energy Security Strategy, where it's again, we know there's a lot of barriers that SME face in accessing information, finance, and so that's something we're trying to overcome. It is still very much in development. So if anyone has thoughts on that, please contact BEIS or me separately later on. Thank you. I'll now hand over to Kit. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for BSI for inviting me to this session of the presentation. Today, my presentation will talk about two separate things. Firstly, I will actually give you a picture of what are the main issues when we are talking about trying to manage energy, getting energy demand reduction, implementing renewable energy, and also around net zero. Then I will actually present what ISO 50001 and also 50005 is resolving. And I'll go in to give you an introduction on how ISO 50001 is a solution to address some of the common problems we experience in industry. So one of the key things when we want to save energy, or when we want to analyze how to implement renewable energy, or even net zero, how do we want to bring down emissions? Often what we find is that people will actually ask the certification bodies. They will put in place a team that consists of the oil and gas producers, the electricity generators, the renewable technology companies, the emerging and the current technology companies. They may even ask the engineering consultancy companies and the management consultancy firms, and more often now than before, behavioral change specialists and the regulators. Yeah. Now, on surface, all of these people sounds rational. They have a genuine interest in and experience in energy management. Now, the unfortunate event associated with pulling these groups of people together is that all of these people represents a supply chain. Yeah, they are within the supply chain of their individual constituents. And primarily their interest is about driving the benefits of the people within their supply chain of activities. And if we add on top of that the needs of the investors, the medias, the local communities, the learned societies, lobby groups and special interest groups, the information that is flooding in the market increases. And then if we add on, for example, additional day-to-day issues that needs to be addressed, now the issues around energy efficiency, energy reduction, renewable energy actually kind of fades a little. And if you think about it very, very closely, none of these actually needs to take action. Yeah, they are suppliers, they are influencers. It is you, the organization, that needs to take the action, and your voice is very, very frequently drowned out by the many, many different types of messages and information that is available in the energy market. And this actually translates to how companies and organizations implement energy reduction. If you take a simple manufacturing plant and look at how they consume resources and how the resources such as energy, raw material, water are being supplied to them, and how waste are being handled, often you would see companies addressing energy efficiency and energy savings at the resource generation portion rather than where it is being used. And when we talk about controlling emissions from the processes, again, what tends to happen is organizations would look at the minimum number of additional process to catch all of the emissions, deal with it independently from its production processes. As such, when we actually do this over many, many years, in fact, this has been the way information has been generated, distributed, and practiced in industry for more than 50 years. By default, it kind of actually creates a practice where companies are constantly looking at what is new in the market that could help them solve the energy issue. What are the big things that is coming up? What are the things that they can do more? And what are the things that are different that is available in the market to help them address issues around energy management, energy reduction, and also reducing GHG emissions. And the knock-on effect is that because companies are constantly looking outwards, they are actually not looking at the processes, because in the end of the day, it is the processes in the organization, the activities in the organization that consumes energy. Yeah, and also another knock-on effect is that all the messages in the market actually forms a pathway, a continuum to drive maximum reduction at a minimum cost if it is stacked up together to create that pathway. Yeah, and that pathway consists of first reducing the consumption, because if you do not need it, then you can actually turn it off, and there is nothing that you can do more to save compared to by not consuming it at all. Then it's about recovering and recycling those energy, applying green chemistry, closing the loop of raw materials and waste, and then also about renewables, afforestation, carbon capture, etc. So if we look at the energy consumption as a whole in this world, and let's equate that as 100% of the total energy consumption. Now, based on a lot of university and technical research, at this present moment, we have technologies and know-how to avoid 73% of the energy consumption. And if this can be realized, we only need to decarbonize but through renewable carbon capture, etc., for the 27% of the energy consumption. And based on what we know at the present moment also, approximately 25 to 35 of the energy consumption can be avoided with either no cost or very little cost and very little changes in operational requirements and in behaviors that can be exhibited. Now, even though we have a huge opportunities to save in all of the organizations, what we are currently achieving on a real-term basis is approximately 1.2% on a year-on-year basis. And this figure has, in general, fluctuate from 0.9% to 1.2% over the last 10 years or so. And if you factor in the annual increase in energy consumption reported on a global basis of about 2.6%, the net is that we are actually not reducing. We are actually not reducing our demand. We are not reducing GHG emissions, because by effect, we are actually growing at about 1.4%. And if you actually plot on what needs to happen if we want to control our global energy increase by 2%, we should be targeting 3% on a year-on-year basis. And at 1.5 degrees, we are actually talking about 7% on a year-on-year basis. So what we can actually see is that what is the actual effort and what is the result it is achieving versus what is needed is very, very different thing. And if you look at very sector specific, you will find that even in the buildings, in the transport sectors, and in industry, there is more than 60% of the energy that is consumed that can be avoided. And this is kind of a good picture to actually inform us that there is opportunities to save significantly compared to the absolute minimum required to generate the same product, to provide the same level of service, or to provide the same level of comfort in buildings. So interestingly, in the recent years, in the last 10 years or so, as a society, we actually start to become much better in analyzing what is the real cause companies not saving energy. This survey was done by Harvard by interviewing the CEOs and the executive people to find out why they are not saving energy. And this is the top 10 reasons cited by this sample of executives in that survey. And what I've done is to group 7 of these 10 reasons in red, things like failures to assess the side effects or the consequence of not saving energy, or uncertainty over the viability of projects, leadership attitudes, insufficient collaboration among the stakeholders in the organization, the corporate culture that is resistant to new ideas, financial constraints, and poor innovation by the suppliers and business partners. Now, if we add the items in red together, nearly 60% of the reason quoted by top management are actually items that is controllable by the organizations themselves. And it will make the internal issues within the organization the biggest reasons why companies are not saving energy. Now, for companies that are successful in getting started in their energy reduction, renewable energy initiatives, and GHG reduction initiatives, many actually stall. And a separate study by Harvard actually found these are the top 10 reasons that is preventing companies from achieving what they set out to do. In fact, if we follow the same color codings, every single issues to stop an organization from achieving its results and aspiration are internal by nature, something that the leaders, something that the managers, something that the engineers and the science-based people can address. So in summary, what I have actually found is that there are 3 elements that are very, very important to drive energy reduction and reduce GHG emissions. That is the strategic alignment, the active management, and the technical analyses. If organizations only have one element, it doesn't work. It will grind down to a halt very, very quickly. Yeah, you will be spreading a lot of your efforts very thinly in everything that is required by the organization. If organization only have 2 of the 3 elements, it will grind down slowly, although it will probably not halt. But achieving the end result will take significant effort, and it will also take a lot of effort in dragging the project to completion. And what is actually needed is that little sweet spot in the middle where all elements are required, and it's where all organization needs to find a way to pull the strategic alignment piece, the active management piece, and the technical analyses piece. Now, in my work, I travel very, very frequently to support many organizations in the world and also many governments to design their policies around energy, good governance, and GHG reduction. And what I found is that there are 10 specific things that are usually lagging in organizations. Yeah, or turn it the other way around. If organization can address these 10 issues, it will be able to leverage their existing energy reduction efforts, renewable energy efforts, to achieve the energy and the climate change aspirations a lot faster. And these 10 elements are actually independent on which management and leadership models that are used in organization. And the 10 leverage points that I have identified over the course of 25 years of work is these 10 items here. Embedding the resource productivity or energy initiatives into the company's strategy. Yeah, it has to be strategy led rather than just an operational led initiative. Yeah. Second is about a need to gain and keep top management commitment, driving towards that vision and that company strategy. And then there's a need to define an appropriate scope and appropriate boundary to analyze and effect energy and GHG reduction. Now, often a lot of the initiatives are actually selected arbitrarily. Yeah, so there is actually a need to use measurement to drive and inform those technical decisions around energy and GHG emissions, benchmark those consumption and emission figures. Now, equally as important, a lot of the energy consumption and GHG emissions are invincible. Yeah, we need to make it visible by using the various analysis tool, and we need to be using science to actually develop the appropriate targets that is based on evidence, and also to identify a set of cost-effective opportunities for improvement. Once we've done that, we can then focus on delivery. Yeah, because when we talk about delivery, it's not something that can be done by the project department or done by a contractor. Yeah, every single part of the organization have a part to play to actually bring all components of the project on time and in full. Yeah, bringing that into alignment will require some form of organization and culture change. And the project needs to be managed actively rather than being led or being dragged through. Yeah, and more importantly, it is about celebrating that success, learning what had happened, what could be improved, and then we rejuvenate and restart the whole cycle. In fact, successful companies actually have long planning cycles. In fact, the longest planning cycles I have observed in organization is 7 years, which means that the energy projects that they have lined up spans 7 years at any one moment in time. And during the period of the pandemic, all they did was just to look at the 7-year program, move some projects around, and the energy reduction and GHG reduction continue on a business as usual basis. And we actually have data to show why good leadership, good active management, and a science and data-driven analyses work. This data was actually done by a colleague of mine by the name of, just hang on a second. Yeah, a colleague of mine, Nicholas Bloom in Stanford, and what he did was to look at the energy intensity of UK's manufacturing sector and actually plot it over a spread of energy intensity per the expected industry mean. And what they've done is to quantify what is the spread of energy intensity of the worst managed 25% of the UK manufacturing company versus the best managed 25% of the UK manufacturing company. And what you can see is that there is a statistical shift lower. Yeah, what it means that the best led and best managed data-driven initiatives are actually consuming less energy compared to the industry mean. In fact, the study actually show that that shift is equivalent to 17.4% energy reduction versus a 3.7 productivity increase. Now, Nicholas actually also saw a reduction in raw material consumption, a reduction in waste, a reduction in capital deployed, and an improvement in skilled labor. However, in Nicholas's work, he did not actually publish the quantified figures for these elements. Now, globally, we have additional information to describe the difference between the best and the worst. In the US, for example, the top 10% versus the bottom 10% actually accounts for 18% productivity increase and 11% skills improvement. In a separate study that I've actually not quoted here, a well-managed company versus the worst managed company in the US, have actually reported a 33% reduction in occupational health and safety incidents. So there is a difference between the need for leadership management and using technical data to drive a lot of our behaviors around energy and GHG emissions. So this is where we could actually improve, because in ISO 50001, issues are addressed through a series of 10 clauses. Starting from the scope, the references, the terms and definition, we have clause 4 defining the scope of the energy management system, which will require 3 inputs to put together. Firstly, it's what is the organization trying to achieve? And then secondly, what are the external issues that affects the way the organization works and achieving its intended outcome? Similarly, what are the internal issues that can drive and deliver the intended outcome? And then the second part is also what are the needs and expectations of the interested parties that needs to be addressed to actually implement the energy management system. Now, this is where the rest of ISO 50001 sits, centered around leadership, planning, support, operations, performance evaluations, and improvements. Now, if we take ISO 50001 and actually see how it maps into the 10 things that I have identified in my own work, and also had a lot of discussions with Robert Kaplan and David Norton, with Nicholas Bloom, and also with my professor in Cambridge, Andy Neely. This is how ISO 50001 maps onto everything that I've identified as commonly lagging in organizations. Now, from an ISO 50005 perspective, what they've done is to describe ISO 50001 requirements over 10 different elements. I'm sorry, not 10, 12 different elements. Yeah, from context all the way down to management review. Now, what they've done with 50005 is to build 4 levels in each of the 12 elements, and therefore giving you an opportunity to build up your energy management system over a period of time through several levels of maturity. Yeah. Now, I will actually look at one of the elements just to give you a little bit more flavor on how ISO 50005 is structured. Now, one thing to note, though, is that implementing an ISO 50005, even at a level 4 level, is not fully compatible with ISO 50001 energy management system. Yeah, and it is not compatible for 3 reasons. Number one, 50005 is a guidance document, and it is not a replacement for a certification. Yeah, at the present moment, only ISO 50001 is certifiable. 50005 is not. In addition, 50005 tend to focus more on the energy performance improvement elements and less so on the management system. The leadership elements and the managerial elements are not equivalent between the 2 standards. So let's take one element and see how they are slightly different, but they are complementary. So the first element in ISO 50005, is context of the organization. If we look at the 4 levels briefly, level 1 talks about a need to create awareness related to energy and environment and their impacts and the applicable legal and other requirements. Level 2 talks about a need to collect information on the energy and environment and other impacts. Level 3 talks about a need to determine the external and the internal issues, identify the risks and opportunities that affect the organization's ability to improve energy performance, determine how legal and other requirements apply. Level 4 talks about top management need to ensure that the needs and expectations of the interested parties are determined, the risks and the opportunities related to the needs and expectations of interested parties are determined, etc., etc. Now, if you compare the maturity level versus what ISO 50001 say you must do, ISO 50001 say you must determine the external and the internal issues relevant to the organization's purpose and that affects its ability to achieve energy performance improvements. Yeah, it is also about the need to determine the interested parties, their needs and expectations. So what you can see here is that ISO 50005 actually have some additional requirements that is going to be complementing ISO 50001 requirements, but are not exactly required in that clause itself. Here, and you will also see in ISO 50001 is about determining the interested parties and their needs and expectations. Yeah, this is very different to what is specified in ISO 50005 at level 4. Needs to ensure that the risks and opportunities related to the needs and expectations of interested parties are determined. Now, they are very completely different items. One, you need to identify who's your interested parties, their needs and expectations. The other talks about you need to identify the risk and opportunities related to the needs and expectations. Very, very different requirement. So while the standard actually gives you a lot of guidance on what needs to be done, now in the book that I've written, I've actually gone on to describe why, what is the evidence behind, and how you could actually implement the various elements that is required. And I've also presented a lot of evidence from real life organizations. So please do come along the journey and implement ISO 50001 and 50005. You are not going to be alone. In fact, you are going to be joining a lot of the companies that are specified and written about in the book. So companies like Dawn Meats in the UK, or Lodge at the Winchester, or even the Barker Tyson are small SME organizations, and they have been benefiting in terms of energy reduction. They have been benefiting in terms of resource productivity, and also in GHG emissions. So you're not alone. Please do come along and implement and get those benefits as well. With that, thank you very much. And I will hand over the session back to Ian.
Thank you, Kit. Thank you. That's very interesting. I'm going to bring us perhaps a little bit more down to earth in some real life examples from very small enterprises, both profit and non-for-profit. But just beforehand, I thought I'd just add a little bit about my own background. One thing I have done over the years is worked with a lot of very small, almost micro enterprises, sometimes even sole traders, largely in the non-manufacturing sector. So I've tended to deal with people perhaps in hospitality, leisure, tourism, some public services. And so perhaps some of the things that I've come across are a little bit different from some of the things that Kit's just been talking about. Next slide, please. As Kit pointed out in one of his later slides, ISO 50005 divides things into 4 different levels of maturity, starting from sort of an enabling level, then through enhancing and emerging until we get an established energy management system. And the sort of companies I've been working with recently are very much working at the bottom end of that ladder, or those steps. They're organizations, they're companies that are just thinking about energy management. They're perhaps not quite sure where to start. And I think just a few observations about how they are finding the process and where they are looking to sort of focus their initial energies could be quite helpful. Next slide, please. So I think the first thing we need to know, and this is part, I think, of the whole thing about the external context of the organization, is what's driving it. Before we know where to start, we probably need to know why we start. What is pushing people in the direction of wanting to improve their energy management? Now, you could argue that quite a lot of it at the moment is due to the gentleman in the photograph and the effect that he has had on energy prices. And indeed, I have some real life examples, as I suspect many of you attending this webinar will have too, where on renewal, a commercial electricity contract, which of course is not bound by the price cap that Ofgem have on domestic, the commercial ones have gone up perhaps by a factor of 3. So maybe someone was paying 8 pence a unit before for electricity, and they're suddenly finding they're paying into the mid-20s or even low 30s. And that is a huge impact. And of course, that's actually, in one sense, a good driver to encourage better energy management, because one of the key benefits is that you should be able to achieve cost savings. But it's not the only driver. As indeed Nasreen pointed out, the UK has national commitments to try and reduce its carbon emissions, and climate change mitigation is very much about reducing GHGs, greenhouse gases, but specifically reducing carbon dioxide, which is by far the largest contributor towards climate change. And in turn, that nearly all comes from the combustion of fuels. And whether it's on site, whether it's in the boilers of a factory or an office, or whether it's indirectly through the use of electricity that's perhaps come from a gas-fired power station. Energy is the biggest general source of CO2 emissions globally, and of course in the UK. So climate change mitigation is a second driver. At the level of small enterprises, at the level of small companies, you might say, well, are they really bothered? Perhaps and perhaps not. A lot of people want to actually try and do in their own company what they would do at home. And because they're very careful and very cautious at home and are fully trying to reduce their impact on the planet, if they then go to an owner-managed business, it's not going to be fine for them to say, oh, actually, I don't have to worry about it. Now I'm at work. People do want to bring their values through to small companies. And of course, also then, there are people who are perhaps under some pressure to do so. It's in the public sector, of course, we've seen a lot of climate emergencies being declared. And I've spoken to quite a number of small councils, mainly town councils in recent months, who have declared a climate emergency and think, right now, that's good. We've done the climate emergency. What do we do now? And it's actually sometimes quite surprising that reducing energy consumption, improving energy management isn't always the first thing they think of. But in practice, it's probably the first thing they should be doing. And in terms of competitive advantage, then there's also a tendency for large companies, it's often quoted as being the Tesco's of this world, but they're by far from being the only one, who are trying to improve better environmental management and better energy management right the way through their value chain, but particularly among the small companies that are perhaps suppliers to them. And to be able to demonstrate that you're working through a process, a formal process, to ISO 50005 can certainly help when it comes to bidding for work from large organisations, from large companies, but both public and private sector actually. So it's the public sector as well as large companies. Next slide. Kit had a list of the 12 elements. I've just arranged them into blocks, but they're exactly the same. I checked the words are the same. These are where ISO 50005 thinks that companies, small businesses should be concentrating. And it breaks it up into nice sort of neat sections on each one with a whole list of things to do. But actually 12 can be quite a daunting number. And if you multiply 12 by 4 levels, as I think was laid out in the array on Kit's slide, with 48 possibilities, it becomes a bit mind-boggling. So today I'm going to concentrate just on the 4 that I find are the ones that most of the businesses I'm working with tend to focus on first. That's not to say they don't get involved with things like leadership. Indeed, the very fact they're probably talking to me means that the leadership of that company is already concerned and has already started thinking about the process. And some of the others, like setting performance indicators or setting targets and plans, are things that follow on fairly naturally from the earlier steps. So let's look and see, first of all, a few more thoughts around the context of the organisation. Next slide. Thank you. Context, as laid out in the standard, can be a little bit dry. It can be talking about energy aspects and environmental aspects. It also have a wider than that. It's actually just looking at what are you doing as an organisation, as a company. What do you do? What's your business? Now, the 3 photos there are all from one I was actually in last week, and their business is quite largely about selling cream teas. Now, okay, that's not very high-tech manufacturing, but it's actually an important part of the hospitality and tourism business. But it's not just about what you see on the plate or even on the wooden block, which is quite a novelty. It's where is this done? It's the building from which it's done. It's the things you've got to do to improve the energy performance, to use less energy in running that building. And this particular example is a historic coaching inn. That in the way quite a lot of historic coaching inn is now non-alcoholic, but nonetheless continues to serve hospitality to people on the main trunk road passing by. And part of that building goes back many hundred years. There's actually a vaulted undercroft that I haven't got a photo of. But they have some very interesting and very specific problems around heating that building, about keeping it at a temperature which is not going to cause deterioration to the fabric. It's not just a question of turning things off. Energy management's a lot better than that. But also going on within that historic building, they have quite a large array of commercial ovens. you probably can't see, but there's a lot more scones in the bottom right-hand picture than there are on the one in the top right-hand, because they pride themselves on manufacturing all their baked goods on site. So they have process going on as well as the front of house side that we can see. So the context can be looking at that and thinking about the energy and environmental aspects associated with those activities. But it's not just the what, it's also the who. The who are the customers, what do they want to find from our business, and who is doing it, who are our employees. That particular one employs, I think something like only 10 or a dozen staff in total, but it's important to get their buy-in as well. 50,005 recognises that the staff resources are just as important as some of the physical elements that you will find in a small business. Next slide. The second one I've highlighted carries on from that point. It is about resources. And I think, again, when it's resources, a lot of people think about going to the bank. They're saying, can we afford to make upgrades? We're a bit short on cash. Can we really afford to do this? Well, I think there's two answers to that. One of which is almost the can you afford not to do it? But the second one is to recognise that not everything costs a great deal of money. As Kit was pointing out as well, when I think he said there was something like 73% for theoretical savings, but of those, I think something like a quarter were ones that could be done at low or very low cost. They might just be housekeeping. They might be getting people to behave slightly differently in the way that they operate things. In some commercial kitchens, you'll find that people come in at the start of service, switch all the burners on, and then don't turn them off. They just leave them on, whether or not they're actually cooking anything. I'm glad to say that the little tea room I was auditing last week wasn't doing that. But there are simple things that can be done that will sometimes require very little access to capital. In some cases, of course, it can be waiting and seeing if there's going to be a grant, if it's a major upgrade. But that's often not an excuse to do nothing. There are usually things that can be done. And again, 50,005 gets you to look at the resources, what you've got available, where can they best be deployed. And of course, the other element of resource is not financial, it's the human resource side. It's about making sure that staff have the right skills and training, that they're motivated, and that they are going along the same journey as you are, that they understand that saving energy is good for the business because it helps financially, but it's also good for the planet. There's lots of ways that we can actually tap into resources rather than simply walking along to the bank and asking for some more money in our checkbook. Next slide. What are the key importances in energy review? That's looking at where we're using energy, what energy we're using. For small businesses, that usually means starting off putting together all your bills. The bills I have there are for just 12 months bill from one small business I've worked with recently. Number of small sites, some of those bills are only for 30 or 40 pounds a quarter. Others are up to sort of several hundred, but they're all quite small. And they're all on paper. And it's a massive task for them actually at the start to pull everything together, to check they've got everything, to actually go and read the meters to ensure that they match what's on the bills, because a lot of the time small businesses will be running off estimated bills if they don't actually nag their supplier to send someone along and read it, or allow a customer reading themselves. So that's important as well. And in an ideal world, it would all be automated. You can, of course, just as you can at home, get smart meters for small businesses. Smart meters have some advantages. They actually show instantaneously very often what's going on. So you can actually switch something on and you can immediately see the change in the energy consumption. But they're often not so good at identifying long-term trends. And that's where businesses that are large enough to be able to qualify for half-hourly data should do so. Next button, please. So here's some half-hourly data. It's just from a random client I've been working with recently. They, in fact, are a leisure centre. And we have three graphs that have been able to be pulled out from that data. The one on the left shows the energy consumption by half hour of day. It's split. Each point on that line is a different half-hour consumption. And we can see a number of things there. We can see that there's a very clear morning peak. There's a very clear late afternoon, or in fact early evening peak. I said it was a leisure centre, and in fact they have a lot of swimming lessons and a lot of use of the gym in the evening, which is why that's the highest in the day. but they also have a very high underlying constant use of energy. And that's always worth investigating. In that particular example, it's because they're trying to maintain the temperature in a pool and they need a minimum level of filtration going on 24/7. But generally, you would expect to see probably rather more in the way of peaks and rather less in the way of continual energy use. The middle graph just looks at it on a monthly basis. That one, again, because of what they're doing, shows relatively little difference between summer months and winter months. There's a slight dip in summer. It seems, in actual fact, the period we see there is from April to March. It's on a financial year, not a calendar year basis. And the reason also that that particular client had a big drop off at the end was due to something called COVID. So they had to shut everything down on about the 20th of March in 2020 rather. And that was the period immediately running up to it. And then finally, the third way of cutting that data is to look at it by day of week. And again, because they operate a 7-day business, they are running very similar levels of energy consumption across each of the days. And in fact, it's slightly lower at weekends because they've perhaps got some office staff functions that are not operating at weekend. Next slide. And the fourth point that I highlighted is again linked very closely to the other one, and that's about measurement and monitoring. Not just reading the meters where it comes into the building or where it comes into the plant, but actually putting in sub-meters, seeing what's used by individual functions. Because if you don't measure, you can't manage. No one really knows who actually first came up with that particular sort of maxim. The management people would claim it's Peter Drucker, but in fact it goes back a lot earlier than that. And I think it's generally accepted that the person who first said that was Lord Jewell, who's the guy sitting there on the right. So it's important to do that, but it's also important that the measurement and the measurement and monitoring systems you have are fit for purpose. You probably can't see the detail, but that's in the middle was somewhere else I wasn't, a different building I was in last week. And yes, that meter, which doesn't look like it's working, probably isn't working. It's probably just as well because it's measuring the temperature in Fahrenheit. And the little red dial at the bottom is in feet of water, which I believe is a measure of pressure, but it's not one I've actually come across in practice. And at some point, someone has strapped on some other meter or measuring device next to it, probably a thermocouple to measure temperature. But even so, it looks pretty old and decrepit. So you need good quality metering if we're to be able to manage properly. And in the bottom left, we have something that's much better, which is a digital output with very clear display, giving you temperature and pressure. Next slide. So that's my very quick run through some of the practical starting points that smaller businesses should be looking at implementing energy management and how ISO 50005 can help them on that particular path. I'd now like to bring back Nazreen and Kit for a general question and answer session. We've already got quite a number of questions in the Q&A box that we will be able to discuss. So if Kit and Nazreen could switch their mics and cameras on, that would be great.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Right, the first question we had, and was sort of, I think, answered by Kit part of the way through, but I'll just repeat it in case it wasn't picked up by everyone. And that was about whether or not there's an expectation that all sites have to be certified or whether it can be centralized to the head office. And I think the answer there very much, Kit, is of course 50005 is not about certification anyway. It's about the journey towards better energy management.
Yeah, the 50005 is not a certifiable standard at the moment. Some certification body may offer that sometime in the future. We don't know. But for now, only ISO 50001 is certifiable. And in terms of ISO 50001 certification, it can be done on a group level, or it can also be done by individual sites.
Fine. So you're saying also, I think, there by implication that 50005 is probably best used by organisations that are, for whatever reason, unable or unwilling to implement a full 50001. That's a question from Michael.
Yes, and to a large extent, what I've seen globally anyway is for every one certification that I see, there are probably about 10 organizations working in implementing various of the ISO standards related to energy management, either 50001 or 50005. But most companies that I notice do not implement the system in one go. They always build up bit by bit over a period of time.
And I think that's where the approach of 50005 with its different elements and different levels, although it might look a little bit complicated at first, actually is very helpful because you can actually pick and choose. You don't have to follow the level sequentially. You don't have to do sort of level 1 across the board, then level 2 across the board. You can do that according to where you are in each of those particular elements. Nasreen, I think the third question was probably aimed more at you, and it was asked saying that they feel that, or Michael Sapp, I think, said that he felt that SMEs are being left on their own to figure it out, which can be quite difficult. Are there any plans to have boots on the ground to help visit SMEs?
I think we recognise in BEIS that there are particular challenges for SMEs, and one of the things we're looking to do, as I mentioned in my presentation, is this energy advice service, where we're hoping to, we're still going to scope it out, so if there's particular ideas, but really we want to provide a sort of website where you can go to and figure out what the type of support you may need, be that technical advice, where you can go to for financial support, different things, but it's more tailored to SMEs really, because we understand that there are different challenges there, different barriers, and access to information is probably one of them. Boots on the ground is a different thing, and not one I can comment on, but I think all ideas are welcomed. It's just a matter of costs, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think sometimes you will find there are sort of local or regional initiatives, sometimes ranging things like Chambers of Commerce or whatever. For example, at the moment in Kent, there's a Kent Green Voucher Scheme where small companies who meet certain criteria can get free consultancy for, I think, up to a value, I think it's about £1,500 through one of a number of nominated consultants, which is a scheme that would probably be able to help people on their sort of road towards energy management as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it is worth talking to your local energy partnerships through your local authorities and others. They may have some advice that is readily accessible. Yeah,
that one's coordinated by the county council, in fact, in Kent, rather than at the lower tier. Right. Quick one for Kit. You mentioned a survey by Harvard. Naomi was just wondering what the geographical location was. Were they primarily US based or were they international?
Oh, that survey by Harvard on the executives, they actually interviewed about 4,000 executives across the globe, but they're not on their own, because shortly after Harvard published their findings, the Economist actually did the same by also serving about the same number of people in the European community. And the UK also did a very, very similar study published in the Financial Times. So I think collectively, on a global basis, we have global, European, and UK specific information, and the reasons that were highlighted were not very far different from the other surveys anyway. So the findings are very comparable.
Thank you. Monib asked a question about sort of practical measures that could be taken. You're saying, can you provide some examples for energy demand cutting which can be done in buildings? And actually, I'm going to answer that one myself, if I may, because I have written down a quick top 10 of the sort of thing that might be done in a building by a small company. The first one I have, or the first few I have, are about lighting, and the second group are actually tends to be around sort of heating and cooling. So do things like checking you've got LEDs in lights. They're not expensive these days. They save even against the CFL. They're more controllable, and check that you're not over lighting rooms. A lot of the time you'll find that commercial rooms have twin strip lights. You don't actually these days with modern lights need quite the intensity of tubes that you had before. By switching to LEDs, it would be great. So that's the first one. Second one is put passive infrareds, PIRs, in rarely used areas. Things like corridors, toilets, storerooms can save quite a lot of energy, even if you're using low energy lighting in the first place. The next one, consider sort of about also daylighting, but think about overheating from daylighting. So perhaps put things like solar film on plate glass windows to reduce that, or some form of external overshading. And also to deal with windows, then consider putting grass stripping. Measures can be done at home as well, not just commercially. The next point we had was to check thermostats and timing on heating, so to check things set to the right temperature. This is very much about managing controls better. And also, gone back to a glazing one here. Sorry, I got those two out of order, didn't I, when I wrote the numbers down. To consider putting blinds, which again can prevent overheating. In most offices, in most retail premises, overheating through windows is more of a problem than heat loss through the windows. And therefore you need to be very careful about shading from that. Check timing on boiler systems, air conditioning, and if you've got a lighting energy management system, that as well, but particularly on heating and cooling systems, check the timing is correct and varies with the year, or the time of the year. Look at zone control. Again, a lot of commercial buildings, you don't need the whole building heated all the time. Particularly at the moment, if people are hybrid working, just heat those zones you need. Number 9 I had was to look at whether or not staff are bringing in unauthorized equipment, particularly little fan heaters that fit under desks, oil-filled radiators. And if so, to actually try and find out why they're bringing in and why are they feeling cold in winter, because that usually indicates that probably maybe if you rearrange the layout of the desks in an office or the workstations, you'd actually be able to avoid people needing to use them. And my final 10th point was a fabric-based measurement. Think also about roof insulation. Commercial buildings are often extremely badly insulated. We have sort of like radiant heaters coming down from the roofs, but they've often just got very thin skins with very little insulation. And so they can lose an awful amount of heat out that way. So that's a quick rundown, Monique, probably far too fast for anyone to capture, but they're sort of 10 relatively inexpensive things that can be done in many commercial buildings. Right.
Yeah, Ian, if I could add just one, I think the best time to actually find opportunities to save is to go into the office in the weekend or at night when no one's there. You will very often find a lot of things that is on that shouldn't be.
That's a very good point. And again, if you've got the metering where we could see the chart I was showing, we saw we had a big baseload demand for heating, so baseload demand for electricity in that particular one. We need to know why we're using that when there's no one in the building. Shivangi had another slightly similar question, and he was asked, he works with SMEs on a day-to-day basis and helps them reduce consumption and decarbonising through research. He feels, however, that most do not have the time or the knowledge or the skills for writing grant applications and hence feel discouraged. And he was wondering how we can incentivize them to do such things and also to adopt the ISO, given that they have only limited resources available. So do Kit or Nasreen have a thing on how we incentivize people to do things?
Yeah, if I could come in first. So what I've actually found is, one, people always say they don't have time or they don't have money to save energy. And so these are some of the interesting ways that I've observed companies overcome those challenges. One is instead of measuring by money how much is going to save and how much is my return on investment, some very aspirational companies, in fact, I'm finding more and more of these companies who are doing it because it is the right thing to do. by the customer expectations, by what the government say the state needs to achieve, or some even actually say my religious belief compels me to save energy by not wasting energy. Now, another way some companies have actually come up with solutions is to club together to actually implement a lot of the projects together. So in Ireland, you've got the energy savings groupings, where a group of people actually come in and try to solve common issues that can be implemented by the members. We see the same thing in Germany, we see the same thing in Japan, and increasingly we are also finding examples from India where small individual and similar industry organizations are clubbing together, right? And we've got this problem, but we don't know how to solve it. But someone somewhere has the solution. And we'll be able to discuss and actually negotiate together. And often when you negotiate as a group, you can actually get better prices and also better economics as well.
Thank you. Nazarene, do you have anything to sort of add on the access to information and resources?
Yeah, I think we recognise this is a real barrier, and for the Industrial Energy Transformation Fund, which is a large fund, it may not be applicable to all SMEs because of its high threshold. We do have a dedicated inquiries handling team. We do run sessions which are recorded and on the web about how to write and complete application forms, because we recognise that's a real barrier. We also do things about feasibility studies and feed studies that will help them get on the way to scoping out that project. So we recognise it's an issue. I think for large funds, we have a little bit more burden of proof, and so when you're ensuring good value for money of government spend, you do need to ask more questions, which can be more burdensome, and I think that is a real barrier for SMEs in particular, and we recognise that, and we're doing all we can to help. I think it's just a tricky one, but we definitely recognise that, and I think that we've seen consultants do come in and help. Many companies do that, but yes, completely agree.
And I think for startups as well, Innovate UK through its UK Edge programme has been able to provide some support and assistance as well.
Yeah, and the Carbon Trust through the Industrial Energy Accelerator Programme, Energy Efficiency Accelerator Programme offers support. There is support out there. It's just at what level, how appropriate. But I think certainly for us in the IETF, we give feedback on applications. We help you with the applications and we give you some feedback if you are not successful and what you could do, and people do that and reapply in subsequent windows. So yes, we acknowledge it. It's not there for all funds, but I'd agree with the point. It needs to happen a bit more.
Thanks. Right, just a couple of quick ones. Katie was noting that for some office-based functions, if people are working in hybrid now, they're perhaps continuing to heat the office, and yet there's also energy being used by the employee at their home, and wondered if there was any easy way of overcoming that. And I guess there the answer, sorry, unless either of you want to jump in, I would just suggest that perhaps it's looking at whether or not you can apply some sort of zonal heating in the office to only heat the bits that are being, and light the bits that are being used, rather than to keep the whole thing going. We also had a question from, I've lost it now, sorry, I beg your pardon, from Graham, who was saying that his company's already got a quality and an environmental management systems to ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, and feels therefore it would be very easy to extend that to energy management with 50001, and therefore wonders whether there is any particular benefit in going for 50005, if you like, as being sort of the junior guidelines. Do you think that there might be an advantage in 50005, or would you advise him to go straight to, if you like, the full management standard?
Yeah, I think in terms of companies who already have certified management systems, 50,001, you will find that approximately 70 to 80% of the requirements are common. And it is those additional elements that need to be implemented. And in this particular instance for Graham, just implement those elements and go straight to 50,001. 50,005 will be of interest if you are very early in the implementation phase, or you need a guided approach over a period of time to actually build up that maturity. And once you get to level 4, the effort required to go to ISO 50001 certification is very small. And after that point, when you talk about the other management system standard, it's about finding the differences that needs to be implemented and go ahead.
Thanks, and I think that probably also addresses a question that we had from Katie, which was asking about if someone has reached 50,005 level 4, how much additional work would you think there would be to move on to a full 50,001 implementation?
Not a lot. I think it's about combing through 50,001 and see what are the elements that potentially has been misplaced, or if there are any missing elements that needs to be closed. I've only got one company that I've worked with in 50,005, and the gap between level 4 for them to 50,001 literally is about 5% extra work.
Right, so that would be relatively easy to bridge, I think, in that case.
Mm-hmm.
And finally, I think I've got a couple of questions from Karen, who's a sustainable startup clothing brand, and she's actually trying to work with underrepresented SME business owners. I suspect possibly either in her value chain, but possibly either suppliers or maybe customers. And she'd like to share information and access on ISO 50005 and asks what's the best resource for getting them to take a look at or action towards reducing energy consumption. Well, I suspect part of the answer is to say, well, actually 50,005, given that it's now freely available, is a good place to start. But do you have any other recommendations, Kit or Nazreen, on that?
Well, I have worked with a few clothing and fashion manufacturers. Unfortunately, my organizations tend to be the large American brands with very well established supply chain. So I can't comment on this.
Okay. And her other question was regarding funding for creating circular low carbon alternatives, which I suspect is a little bit outside the scope of today's session. But I suggest probably there that, and I'm sure she's well aware of that, that I personally would be sort of looking at things like sort of Cedars and Crown Cube, and perhaps some of the more alternative funding, given the focus on sustainability behind it. But it'd be interesting to know whether anyone else has experience here of seeking funding specifically to do energy improvements.
Personally, in my work, I tend not to find companies looking for funding because very often companies who can justify the investment either because of the cost benefit reasons, or because of compliance reasons, or because of the social requirement reasons, they would do it regardless of getting a loan or a fund to do it. And in fact, a lot of the UK companies that I've seen are increasingly moving away from a financial payback to a more socially equitable reasons for implementing energy. For example, employee expectation, making it better for the work environment, making it better for the customer expectations, and using those as a basis to move rather than purely rely on financial returns anyway.
Thank you. And Shivangi had responded to her earlier question about grant access and said that she's aware of IETF and Carbon Trust and has been successful on occasion, but it's very difficult for a small SME to access them, and that there's perhaps now less funding available than presumably at some time in the past, because it could be extremely complicated and difficult to gain access to funds. On that note, I would like to thank my fellow speakers, to thank Nazreen and Kit, and to ask Amanda if there's anything she wants to say as a final remark. I think I have no closing remarks other than to say, if you've not got hold of a copy already, go out and get it. You know, it's being made freely available courtesy of BEIS, and there's a lot there, I think, that even reasonably well managed businesses can find, you know, that they can do even better by following sort of the guidelines within the ISO 50005 on sort of a stepwise approach towards getting better energy management. But back to you, Amanda, in that case.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Ian and Nazreen and Kit. That was very interesting. And thanks ever so much for the questions. Just to build actually on what Ian was saying, please do click on the link, go and download your standard. But also on that page, there's a guide to the standard as well. So that should really help you get started. And so don't forget about, do remember to download the guide. And then do share the link with your colleagues and friends and get it out there. There's 100,000 copies going free. So let's get them out. Thank you very much, everybody.
Will this webinar be available for people to view again if they want?
It will be available. Yes, it will be available. So yeah, please do complete the feedback form, which is really helpful to us, and then you'll receive the slides, I think, and the webinar, a recording of the webinar, which you can also share with your colleagues and others as well. So thanks ever so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Amanda. Thank you, Kit. Thank you, Nazreen.
Bye, everybody.
And thank you, everyone on the audience.